Welcome to the 260 Journey, and welcome to the incredible conversion story of the greatest Christian that ever lived, the Apostle Paul. His conversion story is in our reading today in Acts 9. Paul is murdering and persecuting young Christians, but he's about to be changed forever. And here's his story starting in verse 1. Now Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked for letters from him to the synagogues at Damascus, so that if he found any belonging to the way, both men and women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. As he was traveling, it happened that while he was approaching Damascus, suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. He fell to the ground, heard a voice saying to him, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" And he said, "Who are you, Lord?" He said, "I am Jesus whom you're persecuting. But get up, enter the city, and it will be told to you what you must do." The men who traveled with him stood speechless, hearing the voice but seeing no one. Saul got up from the ground, and though his eyes were open, he could see nothing. And leading him by the hand, they brought him into Damascus. And he was there 3 days without sight, and neither ate nor drank. And then verse 10 says, "Now there was a disciple at Damascus named Ananias. And the Lord said to him in a vision, 'Ananias?' 'Here I am, Lord.' The Lord said to him, 'Get up, go to the street called Straight, and inquire at the house of Judas for a man from Tarsus named Saul. He is praying.'" I'm amazed at how in one day a man goes from breathing threats and murder against the baby church in Acts, and in 10 verses, we find him praying. How does this happen? It's nothing but the power of God's voice and God's word. One word from God can change anyone. I am still amazed at the power of God's word. He does not speak much, but he speaks enough. We are so wordy, and God is so precise with his words. This man was such a tough case that even the disciples took time to believe that a change happened in the Apostle Paul. Just as a side note, I love the dialogue between Ananias and the Lord in verses 10 through 17. God wanted him to lay hands upon the new convert Saul, but Ananias was a little apprehensive due to Saul's reputation. And this is what I love. He dialogues with the Lord and tells him about Saul in verses 13 and 14. It was like the omniscient God has never heard of him before. He tells God what Saul did to the Jerusalem church and what authority the courts have given him, like this is a surprise to the Lord. And God responds back to him, "Go," in verse 15. I think God was probably thinking, just go. I know this already. D. Martin Lloyd-Jones said it like this: "A Christian is a result of the operation of God. Nothing less, nothing else. No man can make himself a Christian. God alone makes Christians." Someone once said, God has no grandchildren. Do you know what that means? Do you understand that phrase? You cannot be a Christian because your parents are Christian. You have to experience God for yourself, and Saul did. Now the murderer is on the path to becoming the key writer of the New Testament. The Damascus Road is the conversion site of the Apostle Paul, and it gives hope to people that you want to see come to Christ, friends and family born again, but they seem so far away. What Paul's conversion shows us is that when people seem furthest from God, they may be closer than you think to being born again. Paul is hunting Christians in verse 2 and praying like the Christians he wants to kill in verse 11. I am so thankful that there is nothing you have done that God can't forgive. Paul was killing Christians. It takes the same grace of God to save the most respectable person in the world as it does the most horrific person in the world. I wonder if that's why no Testament writer wrote more on God's grace than the Apostle Paul. He was the horrific person, and he experienced God's grace. Paul learned what Christian writer Jerry Bridges wrote: "Our worst days are never so bad that you are beyond the reach of God's grace. And your best days are never so good that you are beyond the need of God's grace." It's not just any old grace. It's amazing grace. How sweet the sound. Thanks for joining the 260 Journey.